Got a question for you this morning. Hopefully we'll see how awake you all are. Something to think about is, have you ever seen something little do something amazing? Now, if I was back in youth, I would have you raise your hands and answer this question, but today it's a little bit more rhetorical. Think about when you've seen something little do something amazing. Now, for me, I just recently got a new computer, and I don't know if any of you have spent 10 years between getting new computers, but computers are pretty cool now. My old computer was top of the line back in 2014, and it was really cool. It had a dual-core processor. Some of you computer geeks are going to love some of this stuff. And I was really fired up. I'm like, wow, that's two. That's two more than the other one. Like, that's twice as many cores. My new computer has 18, which boggles my mind, and it's the same size. Cool thing, it actually cost less than my computer did back when I got it in 2014. Now, looking into it, there's even more ways in which this little piece of machinery does more than I've ever imagined a little tiny thing can do. I mean, I know kind of on a level how computers work. I know that electricity goes in, there's gates that open and close, right? Or am I being really old school? There's ways that the electricity gets routed and does things. But when I think about how small that little processor is and the amount of work that it's capable of doing, it completely boggles my mind. Now, to date myself even further, I remember when I was in college, I was really excited to get a thumb drive the size of my thumb that had 128 megabytes worth of storage in it. I was thinking, wow, I can fit so many things on here, so much more than I could fit before. And I was so impressed with it. Some of you are already thinking, today, did you know that you can get a micro SD card with 4,000 times that amount of storage? 4 terabytes on a thing that's not now the size of your thumb, but your thumbnail. And it can hold up to 4 terabytes, which is, again, I don't even know how I would fill that much space. Thing, though, is that these things may be little in size, but they are doing pretty amazing things, but it's all things that they were designed to do. Now, if we think a little less literally, maybe when you guys were thinking of your examples, something little wasn't necessarily something small. Maybe something little was more like something insignificant. Maybe it was something that couldn't possibly do something amazing. Maybe it was something like a conversation, or maybe it was something like a small amount of money or a small object that you have. And I want to know, do you think it could ever do anything amazing? Maybe we think something insignificant, ordinary, and common could do something if it had just a little extra push. Maybe if it had a little extra power behind it, maybe it could. So we're going to be in John chapter 6 this morning. And we're going to be in verses 1 through 15. While you look there on your either your digital device or your paper Bible, both are good. They're both scripture. What we're going to see in this passage is something that's often relegated to the world of fantasy, to the world of comic books or giant movies. It's the kind of world-bending, reality-warping, sometimes fear-inducing power that we never think we're actually going to see in real life. It seems like the stuff for children to believe, but something like this, or something in a movie, but it's never something that we as rational adults are ever going to see, or something that we just can't even imagine seeing in real life. But as we'll see, it is this level of power that's necessary to make the ordinary extraordinary. It is this kind of power that is necessary to take something insignificant and make it incredibly significant. It's power like this that gives things purpose. It's power that takes these things and does more than we could even imagine it doing. So we're going to be in John chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 1. And if you're there, say there. Always wanted to do that. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Now let's set the scene. The other gospel writers give us a little bit more context here, and just so you know, if you're ever on Jeopardy and they ask you a Bible trivia question, this is one of the only, I think actually the only miracle that is mentioned in all four gospels. The other gospel writers give us some context here, and they tell us that this crowd isn't just like a group. It isn't the size of this room. If anything, it's closer to 30 times the size of this room. And they are following him around, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jesus or his next miracle. There's an excitement about this. There's a fervor in this crowd. It isn't just a nice group of people kind of wandering around, being all quiet like a procession. No, this is a group of people who are probably fighting against each other to catch a glimpse, just to see a little bit of what this guy named Jesus is doing. At this point, it's probably becoming a little bit of a nuisance. Could you imagine 5,000 families following you around trying to get a glimpse of what you were doing? Like, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time when, like, my kids are just trying to figure out what I'm trying to do, and I have 2 of them. I can't imagine 5,000 families looking at everything that I'm doing and following me around. Could you imagine the noise of 5,000 families? To give you some context here, how many of you have seen a game at the State Farm Center recently? Did you guys know the record attendance there? About 17,000 people, which on paper doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've been in that place and you've seen a winning basket, you know that that can be a loud group of people. And could you imagine having that many people follow you around from place to place? Can you imagine the difficulty of trying to find a place to sit? Can you imagine the difficulty of trying to teach over that loudness of people? And I love it because it's not just, the scripture says that it's 5,000, but that was just counting the 5,000 heads of families. Like, this wasn't adults. This was kids. Kids were running around. They were screaming. They were playing. They were having fun. Parents were trying to lead after them. It was this chaos that was going on. But I love the dedication of the crowds to follow Jesus. They know something's going on with this guy, and they want to see what it is. Now, Jesus is about to do something huge. And this passage is going to show us 3 ways we usually respond when he asks us to join in. And I love this. Jesus could have just done what he wanted to do without asking anybody their opinion or asking them for help. He could have made it rain from the sky. He could have done whatever he wanted. But instead, he looks to his disciples. He looks to the crowd and he says, how are we going to accomplish this? So continuing in verse 5 of chapter 6, we see, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him because he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to even have a bite. We see the first response when Jesus invites us into something huge. Sometimes we get a little pragmatic. Now, Philip heard Jesus say, buy, so he immediately began taking stock of what they had and tried to see if he can make it work. Being pragmatic is not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes it's our default when we're asked to do something. Now, they were near a town of Bethsaida, which is actually where Philip and, we'll find out later, Andrew were from. It wasn't a large town. Maybe a few hundred people were there, and even if there was a place where they could buy some food, it would take a lot of money. Now, this is where the original language gives us some extra clarity here. At first, we read Philip's response, and I don't know about you, but it sounds like he's a little, angry or kind of taken aback by what Jesus says. And Jesus, it would take more than half a year's wages to feed everybody. That's not really the tone we get in the original language. In the original language, he says specifically, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough to give everybody a bite. Do you see the shift in tone there? What he's doing is actually he's looking at what they most likely had in their treasury. They probably had about 200 denarii, which was close to half a year's wage for a working class person at the time. And he was saying, okay, Jesus, I see that I have 200 denarii. I have 17,000 people. It's not going to be enough. There's no way. If we offer it to them, they're still going to be hungry. If we offer them this food, if we use everything we have, it's not going to be enough to feed them. Notice this isn't a bad approach. It's actually wise of Philip to take stock of what he has. And maybe we would even say that he was trying to do what Jesus asked. He was looking at what he had available and said, okay, well, maybe if I go to my friend who's a baker and he gives us enough time, maybe he can make enough food for them to get, but I want to make sure I pay him enough, and it just didn't work. The problem here is not that he is being pragmatic, it's that he's just a little short-sighted. Philip is so concerned with what they have and how it's not enough. So let's read on and see what the second response can be. In verse 8, it says, another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? This shows us a second response, which is some skepticism. Andrew brings this child to Jesus, but let's look a little closer at his words. Now, I'm a bit of a language nerd, and if you don't know this, the New Testament was not originally written in English. It was originally written in Koine Greek. And there are some things within the Greek language that are just kind of hard to bring out to keep it readable. And there are some translations that do this, maybe you have read them, where it gets really wooden, is probably the best way to describe it. As you read through, they're trying to maintain the word order, or maybe they amplify words, and you get a bunch of words that don't seem to make sense in the context. And this is where I prefer readable translations, but it's where it's beneficial sometimes to dig that little deeper, find a commentary, find some Bible software, and look into the language a little closer. In Greek, they have this diminutive, which is very similar, if those of you who've studied Spanish, to adding like an ita or ito at the end of a word. It makes it little. It makes it cute. English doesn't really have a clear example of that, except if like your voice just gets a little higher, like, oh, look at that cute little, look at that. That was a much higher voice. Look at that little, oh, that's so cute. Like that baby voice almost thing. And I think it's funny because Andrew uses the diminutive 3 times in a sentence. He uses it to describe the littleness of the boy. He uses it to describe the littleness of his loaves and the littleness of his fish. It's almost like he's saying, hey, Jesus, you want to see something adorable? This little boy has brought us his little lunch. It's like, oh, it's so cute. Look at the little loaves of the little fish. Isn't that precious, Jesus? And now, the English is still not quite doing it enough, so I'm going to give you a visual. It'll be very similar to this. So that's my daughter. She's 2. And she's holding up a Lunchable. Isn't that cute? Aw, you think that's going to help? That's so cool. There's 17,000 people here. That's not enough, but that's adorable. And that's where I think some people give Andrew a hard time. They're like, his thoughts were clear on this, that he didn't think this was going to be enough. But I honestly think we see small boy, and with the diminutive, it probably was like a toddler who was like, I have this. And Andrew's like, oh, buddy, you're giving us a little snacky from your packy. But it does show skepticism because he does say to Jesus, this is adorable, this is amazing, but like, it can't really feed all these people, right? Like, can it? And within this, we also see that there's a third response, and that's just straight up faith. The little boy didn't care about whether or not his meal would provide. The little boy didn't think about, well, if I give this up, then I'm not going to have something to eat. Or will this give me the kind of return on investment that I'm hoping it will? Or Jesus, I'm really concerned that I'm not going to have enough food to eat, but okay, if you would like to take what little I have, then I trust you. No, he said, there is a need. I have a lunch. Here you go. It's such a little kid thing to do, right? And I love kids for this. I love that kids are so quick to be like, okay, I heard that you need food. Here's food. I heard that there's a need. There's people around here who want lunch. I know what lunch means. Lunch. And I think it's interesting because when we look at this, we see that God, like this kid, just knew that in Jesus' hands, his lunch was going to do more than it would do in his. He just knew that if he offered it up, then something could happen. But if he withheld it, then nothing could. And I want us to get this because God can do far more with your little than you can. I know this for a fact because I've seen it in my own life time and time again. God will take a little and he will make it incredible. Not because he needs us to offer him anything, but because our story will then become so much more personal and powerful when we see God work through us and the little things we offer. Can you imagine the story that this little boy is going to have? Can you imagine him going home to his mom, who probably packed him the lunch, and said, you want to see something cool? I gave my lunch to Jesus, and he did something crazy with it. But I love this too because even though it seems little to us, this was not a little thing for this kid. This was his meal. He was prepared. All the other people weren't. If they wanted lunch, maybe they could have brought their own. But instead of keeping it for himself, he chose to find somebody and offer it. And this is what I love because later on, Jesus tells us that we need to have faith like a small child. We need to have the same kind of faith that goes to Jesus and says, I don't know what you can do with this, but I trust that you're going to do more than I can. And another fun little language tidbit here for you is that when Jesus says that you need to have the faith like a small child, he uses the exact same word that Andrew uses for the small boy. The same diminutive, little kid thing. And I know Jesus never does anything without several layers of meaning behind it, so wouldn't be surprised if he was pointing to something. So now, up until this point, many of you are familiar with this story. You know what's going to happen. But for those of us who don't, and for those of us who have heard this story 1,000 times, just clear your mind of all the things you already know. And just focus into the craziness of this situation. The power that we are about to see. Because up until this point, we've seen Jesus do some pretty amazing things. He's healed diseases that had no cure. He knew things that he shouldn't be able to know. Now, each of these signs and wonders was a little bit more individual. He healed a sick person. He provided wine for a party. He knew the thoughts of a group of people. But this is going to ratchet it up just a little bit further because we see a gigantic crowd, and now Jesus is going to do something beyond what is possible. This is a true miracle in the sense that all of his miracles are, but the definition of a miracle is to do something that breaks the laws of physics, that breaks the way things are designed to work. And now I love this because it isn't because of just some supernatural problem. He didn't show up with a crazy show of power because somebody was dead and he raised them. He hasn't done that yet. He didn't show this because of an emergency. Yes, the people were hungry, but they weren't starving. They were away from home, but they were not incapable of getting food. This is important for us to remember because sometimes it can feel like we don't want to bother God with little things. We don't want to bother him with our hunger or our thirst. We don't want to bother him with fear that we have, maybe, that seems small. We don't want to bother him with praying for a promotion or praying for something to happen in our lives, maybe a friend or a relationship that we desire. You see, Jesus cares as much about the little things as he cares about the big things. He created us to have needs. He created us to depend on him. He created us with hunger and thirst to be nourished by his creation. These emotions can also indicate a stronger hunger and thirst for what God can satisfy. Now, when Jesus performs his miracle, focus in on the way that he shows how true power should be used. He doesn't bring glory to himself, but he uses it to even help those around him. In verse 10, we read this. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now, there was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus took the loaves, he gave thanks, and he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. When they had had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Jesus took a child's Lunchable and fed 17,000 people with it. And he didn't do it in this like big, showy, miracle, rain down from the sky kind of thing. He did it as if he was just handing out food, as if it was a buffet line, and he just said, okay, come on up. Here's some loaves, here's some fish. Then that person walked away, and they're like, I'm pretty sure I got it all. Like, think I saw what the kid had. I don't know, maybe he had a duffel bag full of something. I don't know, but pretty sure this is all he had. Okay, Jesus gave it to me. They walk over, and then another person comes in line, and they get maybe even more. Next person has a bigger need. Next person has a different need. Each person gets fed until eventually they're looking around and seeing everybody has food, and we're not sure how. And not just a little, but they're satisfied. They have enough. And even beyond that, the disciples walk around with baskets and they clear the leftovers and they fill baskets with what's still there. So the people were not just fed to meet their need, they were fed until they were satisfied. They were fed and had as much as they wanted. Now remember that timestamp that John gave us at the beginning of the passage? It's a little aside that John throws in there that you might have missed. It says, this was near the time of Passover. Now, after God brought his people out of Egypt, they wandered around the desert for 40 years. And when they talk about Passover, what happened after would have been fresh in their minds. When Moses prayed for God to provide food then, the food that God provided, which was a flaky little bread called manna and also some quail, was for that day only. If they tried to take more than what they needed for the day, it would rot the next day. The only time this was different was on the Sabbath, when God provided for them to take 2 days' worth of food, and it would last until that next day. But then on the third day, it would rot, and they would have to collect more. What Jesus is showing here is that he is better than Moses. He isn't just a prophet that has come into the world. He is the prophet. He is the fulfillment of all of the prophecies about him. He takes a miracle they would have been familiar with and he ratchets it up into a whole new realm to where they now have food that lasts. They have food that sustains. They don't just get what they need, they get what they want. It's still food, so it doesn't last forever. But later, Jesus is going to teach that this food is going to point to a greater spiritual reality. And you all are going to have to come back next week to find out what he's talking about. Now, finally, we get a glimpse into the people's hearts. So we have these responses of Jesus' people, his disciples, but then the wider crowd gives us kind of an idea of maybe what's going on in their heart. You know, they see Jesus' miracle, but instead of recognizing what he came to do, they try to make him into something that they want him to be. In verse 14, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. See, there'd be two types of people in this crowd. Maybe we relate to some of them. One would be devout Jews who were preparing for the crossover. Now, in their minds, they might be thinking that they might be reminded that before his death, Moses promised the Israelites this. It's from Deuteronomy 18:15. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You must listen to him. Jesus providing for the physical needs of the people would have connected him to Moses in some people's minds, and especially as the people were remembering the story and hearing it as they prepared for Passover. John wants us to see here that Jesus is that greater Moses, but he also wants us to see that what Jesus is bringing now is far greater than the Exodus. You see, the Exodus happened right before Passover when God's people had to sacrifice a young lamb in order to save their sons. Now, God is preparing the world for when he will sacrifice his own son to save his sheep. his people. Moses provided manna and quail to meet the daily needs of their people. Jesus provides bread and fish in abundance, with 12 baskets left over. Moses led God's people out of bondage in Egypt into freedom, but Jesus is going to lead his people out of bondage to sin and death into true freedom and eternal life. Now, the second group in here may not be thinking about any of that. Maybe they were just interested in Jesus because of the miracles he was doing, or maybe a friend dragged them along and said, "You got to see this dude." Maybe they were just really excited that they got a free lunch. Who knows? Like the woman at the well that we read about back in John 4, maybe these people are thinking a little bit more practically. Maybe they're thinking, this is a person who can provide food whenever we need it? Score! Like, you mean I'll never have to buy food again? This is awesome. I mean, it was like some sardines and pita pockets, but like, do you think he could do that with any food? Because like tomorrow, I am totally bringing him some steak and truffle fries, and we're going to see if he could just make this a meal, man. And they get so excited that like, you know what's really cool to not have to worry about? One of the basic necessities of life. Never have to worry about food again. We follow this Jesus dude. He's got us. He's going to feed us. They saw Jesus as a way to provide comfort. They saw him as a way to take care of needs, but nothing more. And that's enough for them. And again, next week, we are going to talk about what happens when Jesus starts talking about something a little more serious. When Jesus starts revealing what this is supposed to point toward. I think you'll be a little surprised how the people react to it. But what does this mean for us today? Another question for you is this, and I want you to think about it this week. If you have your I am journals, or if you are a regular journal, write this down. Write this question down and think about it this week. What do you really want from Jesus? This is a question that sometimes can wreck my day. There are times where I think about this question and I think about my prayers and I think, man, I am so focused on just what he can give me. And I'm not more focused on what he is doing in the world. Tim Keller, theologian and author, said this, and I love this question. It's what you go to God to get is often your real God. I'm going to say that again. What you go to God to get, what you ask him for, can sometimes reveal what your real God is. If we go to him for financial security, if we go to him for whatever it is, sometimes that's what we're really worshiping instead of him. And now that's not to say that God doesn't want to give us good things. He does. But what do we really want from him? Is Jesus just a super powerful genie who can grant all your wishes and give you food whenever? Or is he the only God powerful enough to free you from your selfish desires? Is Jesus who you think will make everything work out for your comfort and security, or does he have a much bigger, better plan for all of humanity that he is offering or inviting us into? Is he here to serve our needs, or are we here to serve him? Now, my hope for each of us is that we recognize that Jesus is inviting us into his mission. He is not being invited into ours. And finally, maybe we just need to be reminded of what little can do in the hands of a big God. I know some of you are in here today because someone took a little bit of their day to talk to you about some huge questions. I know some of you made a small decision and now you're seeing the benefits of saying no to a lifestyle or a group of people who are bringing you down and leading you on the wrong path. And you're seeing the benefits of being uprooted from that and being planted in good soil. Some of us may be facing something huge right now, and when we look around, we see nothing but little things. What would it look like to take that and place it in the hands of Jesus? I bet you can't even imagine what he can do with it. My encourage to you today is to not worry about the little that you have, but to trust, to give it to the Lord and see what he does with it. Now, another little thing that carries a huge meaning is communion. We're going to be entering into a time of communion here. Now, if you haven't picked up your elements, there's some at the entrances. Please feel free to grab some. Or if you have it in your pocket, pull it out. This little bread and this little cup point us to a huge reality. That the all-powerful God of the universe came to our little earth as a baby. He grew up and he did some huge things, but ultimately, he conquered death and sin on the cross for us. And if that weren't enough, he rose again from the dead. Now, before you take communion, I want you to take some time to think about what Jesus has done for you. Not just what he's done for us, but what he has done for you, personally, individually. Be reminded that he can take the smallest things and turn them into extraordinary things. Think about what you want to give him today. And I promise that he will do so much more with it